Irene Hill was the kind of woman people instinctively wanted to protect. Soft-spoken, gentle, with tears that came easily, and a smile that could melt the coldest heart. Her colleagues at the community center treated her like delicate porcelain, always careful, always accommodating. Her boyfriend, Daniel, saw her the same way: beautiful, vulnerable, someone who needed his strength. But on a sunny Tuesday afternoon in a quiet parking lot outside Lyon, France, when 12 men surrounded their car with malicious intent, Daniel discovered something that would shatter every assumption he'd ever made about the woman he thought he knew. What happened in those 7 brutal minutes would prove that sometimes the most dangerous mistake you can make is confusing kindness with weakness. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more inspiring stories. The community center in the Lyon suburb of Vaux-en-Velin had never been quiet. But on this particular morning, it felt especially chaotic. Children ran through the corridors, their laughter echoing off the worn tile floors, while volunteers juggled, donated clothing, food supplies, and the endless paperwork that came with running a non-profit organization serving refugee families. Irene Hill moved through the chaos like a dancer through a storm, graceful, unhurried, and seemingly unfazed by the noise. At 26, she had worked at the Centre d'Accueil et d'Intégration for 3 years, and in that time, she'd become the person everyone turned to when things fell apart. Not because she was the loudest or the most assertive, but because she had a way of making people feel heard, understood, and cared for. "Irene, we have a family arriving from Syria in an hour, and we don't have enough blankets," called out Thomas Beaumont, the center's assistant director, his voice tinged with the familiar panic that seemed to strike him multiple times a day. Irene looked up from the intake form she was completing for a Sudanese family and smiled softly. "Check the storage room in the East Wing. We received a donation last Thursday. There should be at least 20 wool blankets on the 3rd shelf." Thomas blinked in surprise. "How do you remember these things?" "Someone has to," Irene replied gently, returning her attention to the form. This was typical of how people saw Irene: helpful, organized, and impossibly kind. But there was something else they noticed too, something that made them treat her differently from the other volunteers. Irene cried easily. A sad story from a refugee family would bring tears to her eyes. A child's drawing of their lost home would make her voice crack. Even conflict among volunteers could leave her visibly shaken, retreating to the bathroom to compose herself. "She's too sensitive for this work," Thomas had once confided to the center's director, Madame Laurent, a stern woman in her 60s who ran the organization with military precision. "I worry about her. This job requires emotional resilience." Madame Laurent had studied Irene thoughtfully before responding. "She's been here 3 years, Thomas. Longer than half our staff. Maybe her sensitivity is exactly what makes her good at this work." But even Madame Laurent treated Irene with a certain carefulness, as if she might break under too much pressure. When difficult families arrived, those traumatized by violence, those angry at their circumstances, Irene was often redirected to paperwork or inventory management. When tensions rose between volunteers, Irene was shielded from the conflict. It was done with kindness, with good intentions. But the message was clear. Irene Hill was too fragile for the harsh realities of the work. Daniel Rousseau had noticed this about Irene from the moment they met at a fundraising event 6 months ago. She had been organizing the silent auction, her clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield, her eyes welling up as she listened to a donor describe their reasons for supporting refugee assistance. Daniel, a junior architect with a firm downtown, had been immediately drawn to her vulnerability. "You're very passionate about this work," he'd said, approaching her after she'd excused herself to dab at her eyes with a tissue. "It's hard not to be," Irene had replied, her voice soft. "These families have been through so much. Sometimes it just overwhelms me." Daniel had felt a surge of protectiveness that both surprised and pleased him. Here was someone who needed looking after, someone whose gentle nature required his strength. Over the following months, as their relationship developed, This dynamic became the foundation of how they related to each other. Daniel was the strong one, the protector, the one who handled difficult situations. Irene was the sensitive one, the emotional one, the one who needed his support. "You work too hard at that center," Daniel would tell her as they shared dinner at his apartment. "You let them take advantage of your good nature. You need to learn to say no." "I don't mind," Irene would reply, smiling at his concern. "It's important work. But you come home exhausted and upset half the time. You can't save everyone, Irene. You're too soft-hearted for your own good." Irene never argued with these assessments. She would simply smile and change the subject, and Daniel would feel satisfied that he was looking out for her, protecting her from a world that might take advantage of her gentle spirit. What Daniel didn't know, what no one at the center knew, was that Irene Hill had a history that contradicted everything they assumed about her. Before moving to Lyon, before taking the job at the refugee center, Irene had spent 4 years studying in Prague, where she'd become deeply involved in the city's underground martial arts community. It had started as a way to process her own family's history. Her grandfather had been a Czech resistance fighter during World War II, and his stories of survival had left a mark on young Irene. The martial arts training had been intense and comprehensive. She'd studied Krav Maga under an Israeli instructor who'd served in special forces. She'd learned Filipino martial arts from a teacher who specialized in weapon defense. She'd trained in Brazilian jiu-jitsu, focusing on techniques that allowed smaller practitioners to neutralize larger opponents. For 4 years, she'd trained 6 days a week, pushing her body to limits that would have surprised anyone who knew her now. But when Irene moved to Lyon to take the job at the refugee center, she'd made a conscious decision to leave that part of her life behind. The work with vulnerable families required softness, required openness, required the ability to be emotionally available in ways that contradicted the hardened vigilance her training had instilled. So she'd stopped training, stopped talking about that period of her life, and embraced the gentler version of herself that the work demanded. Her colleagues saw her tears and assumed weakness. They saw her kindness and assumed fragility. They saw her emotional availability and assumed she needed protection. And Irene let them make these assumptions because, in truth, she preferred this version of herself. The fighter she'd been in Prague had felt necessary but also isolating. The emotional, caring person she'd become in Lyon felt more authentic, more aligned with who she wanted to be. Only occasionally, late at night, when she couldn't sleep, would Irene practice a few movements in her small apartment, muscle memory keeping skills alive that she hoped never to use again. Daniel had once walked in on her, executing a complex defensive sequence in her living room, and had laughed, thinking she was doing some sort of dance or yoga routine. "My little ballerina," he'd teased, kissing her forehead. Irene had smiled and let him believe it, pushing away the memory of what those movements actually were, what they were designed to do. As she finished the intake paperwork that morning at the center, Irene had no way of knowing that within hours, every assumption people had made about her would be tested. That the sunny Tuesday afternoon would bring a situation that would strip away the carefully constructed persona of fragility and reveal the person she'd been hiding beneath layers of gentleness and tears. The day continued normally. Families arrived and were processed. Donations were sorted. Small crises were managed with patience and care. And Irene moved through it all with her characteristic grace, unaware that she was hours away from a parking lot confrontation that would change everything. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as Irene and Daniel walked toward his car. It was just after 4 o'clock, and Irene had finished her shift at the center. Daniel had picked her up as he often did, and they'd planned to drive to his parents' house in the countryside for dinner, a weekly tradition that Irene had grown to enjoy despite the hour-long drive. "You look tired," Daniel observed as he clicked the remote to unlock his silver Peugeot. "Rough day." "Just busy," Irene replied, slipping into the passenger seat. "We had 3 new families arrive, and one of the children was so traumatized she wouldn't speak. It took me 2 hours just to get her to accept a blanket." Daniel shook his head as he started the engine. "See, this is what I mean. You take on too much emotional burden. You need to learn to maintain professional distance." Irene smiled, but said nothing. This was a familiar lecture, one Daniel delivered with genuine concern, but also with a certain satisfaction. As if her emotional exhaustion validated his role as her protector, she leaned her head against the window and watched the suburbs of Lyne slide past. The familiar landscape of apartment blocks and small shops that characterized this working-class neighborhood. The community center was located in an area that had struggled with economic challenges for decades. Volks and Villen had a reputation sometimes deserved, sometimes exaggerated for higher crime rates than other Lyon suburbs. But Irene had never felt unsafe during her 3 years working there. The local community had embraced the refugee center, and most residents saw it as a positive addition to the neighborhood. As Daniel navigated through the narrow streets toward the highway, Irene noticed his expression had grown tense. "Everything okay?" she asked. "I don't like picking you up from this neighborhood," Daniel admitted. "It's not safe, Irene. You shouldn't be working in an area like this." "It's perfectly safe," Irene protested gently. "I've never had any problems." "That's because you've been lucky," Daniel countered. "A woman like you, working in a place like this, it's asking for trouble." "A woman like you." Irene heard the phrase and understood what Daniel meant. Fragile, vulnerable, unable to defend herself. She felt a familiar frustration rise but pushed it down. Daniel meant well. His protectiveness came from a good place, even if it sometimes felt suffocating. They were waiting at a traffic light when Irene noticed the group of men on the corner. 12 of them, ranging in age from late teens to mid-30s, clustered around 2 motorcycles and a battered van. Something about their posture, the way they were watching cars pass, triggered an old instinct in Irene, the kind of situational awareness she'd developed during her training years but had suppressed during her time at the refugee center. "Daniel, turn right at the next street," she said quietly. "What?" "That's not the way to the highway." "I know, but I think we should take a different route." Daniel glanced at her with amusement. "Irene, are you worried about those guys on the corner?" "We're in a car. They can't do anything to us." Before Irene could respond, the light changed, and Daniel continued straight through the intersection. As they passed the group of men, Irene watched them in the side mirror. Several were now watching their car with focused attention, and one was speaking rapidly into a phone. "Daniel, something doesn't feel right," Irene said, her voice more urgent now. "You're being paranoid," Daniel replied. But there was a slight edge to his voice that suggested he'd noticed something too. They'd driven another 3 blocks when Irene saw the van from the corner pull out into traffic behind them. "Daniel, that van is following us." Daniel checked his rearview mirror, and his casual confidence evaporated. "That's probably coincidence. We're all heading toward the highway." But when Daniel made a sudden turn onto a side street, a test Irene recognized immediately, the van followed. And not just the van. 2 motorcycles had appeared from a parallel street, boxing them in. "What the hell?" Daniel's voice had risen in pitch, panic creeping in. "What do they want?" Irene's mind had shifted into a different mode, one she hadn't accessed in 3 years. She was already calculating distances, angles, potential escape routes. The side street they'd turned onto was narrow, lined with industrial buildings that would be closed on a Tuesday afternoon. Bad terrain for escape, good terrain for an ambush. "Drive faster," Irene said calmly. "Don't stop for anything." But, as they rounded the next corner, they found the street blocked by a delivery truck that had conveniently broken down, its driver nowhere in sight. Daniel slammed on the brakes, and within seconds, they were surrounded. The van pulled up behind them, blocking retreat. The motorcycles positioned themselves on either side, and from the van and from doorways of seemingly abandoned buildings, men began to emerge. 12 of them, just as Irene had counted on the corner. All young, all moving with the coordinated precision of people who'd done this before. This wasn't random street crime. This was organized, planned, and they'd been specifically targeted. Daniel's hands were shaking on the steering wheel. "Oh God. Oh God. What do we do?" One of the men, tall with a shaved head and a scar across his left cheek, approached Daniel's window and tapped on it with something metallic. A tire iron, Irene noted. The universal signal to roll down the window or they'd break it. Lock the doors, Irene said quietly. And call the police. They're already locked, Daniel replied, his voice barely above a whisper. But Irene, there are 12 of them. Even if I call the police, they won't get here in time. The man with the tire iron struck the window harder, creating a spider web of cracks. Around the car, the other men were closing in. Some with weapons visible: bats, chains, one with what looked like a crowbar. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. Daniel, call the police now, Irene repeated, her voice still unnaturally calm. Tell them our exact location and that we're being attacked by 12 men with weapons. Daniel fumbled for his phone, his hand shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. What are you going to do? I'm going to buy you time to make that call, Irene said simply. Before Daniel could protest, before he could tell her to stay in the car where it was safe, Irene opened her door and stepped out into the sunny afternoon. The circle of men paused, surprised by this development. They'd expected fear, expected the car's occupants to cower inside until they smashed through. They hadn't expected a small woman in a floral dress to voluntarily emerge. The man with the tire iron laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the industrial buildings. Look at this, boys. The little bird wants to negotiate. Irene stood beside the car door, her posture relaxed but balanced in a way that none of the men recognized as significant. She could hear Daniel behind her, his voice shaking as he spoke rapidly to the emergency dispatcher. She needed to give him at least 5 minutes, maybe more depending on police response times in this neighborhood. What do you want? Irene asked, her voice gentle, the same tone she used with traumatized children at the refugee center. What do we want? The scarred man stepped closer, swinging the tire iron casually. We want the car. We want whatever money you have. We want your phones. And then we want you to forget you ever saw us. Behind him, the other men were spreading out, forming a tighter circle. Irene recognized the tactics surrounding prey, cutting off escape routes. Several were recording on their phones, she noticed. This would be documented, shared, proof of their power and their victims' helplessness. The car belongs to my boyfriend's father, Irene said reasonably, as if they were having a normal conversation. It has a tracking system. You'd be caught within an hour. The scarred man's smile faded. Then we'll take everything else and teach you both a lesson about driving through our neighborhood. Your neighborhood? Irene tilted her head slightly. I work 2 blocks from here, at the Centre d'Accueil et d'Intégration. I've been here 3 years. I've never seen any of you before. This observation seemed to irritate the scarred man. We don't care where you work, lady. This is our territory, and you're going to pay the tax for passing through it. Behind Irene, she could hear Daniel's whispered conversation with the police dispatcher. They have weapons. Yes. 12 men. Please hurry. His voice was rising in panic, which wouldn't help. The men would feed off that fear, would escalate their aggression in response to it. I understand you want to feel powerful, Irene continued, her voice still impossibly gentle. But this situation doesn't have to end badly for everyone involved. One of the younger men, barely 20 with nervous energy radiating from him, laughed sharply. End badly? Lady, you're surrounded by 12 of us. This ends badly for you, not for us. Irene smiled sadly, and for a moment, she looked exactly like the fragile woman everyone assumed her to be. That's not quite accurate, she said softly. You see, you're assuming I'm helpless because I'm small and because I'm a woman. You're assuming I'll be an easy victim because I came out of the car instead of hiding inside. The scarred man's expression darkened. Stop talking and give us your valuables before we take them by force. I'm trying to give you a chance to walk away, Irene replied, and now there was something different in her voice, something that made the scarred man pause. Because once this starts, Someone is going to get hurt. Probably several someones. And I'd rather that didn't happen. Is she threatening us? One of the men asked, genuinely confused. I think the little bird has lost her mind. Another replied. The scarred man stepped forward, raising the tire iron. Last chance, lady. Wallet, phone, jewelry. Now. Irene looked past him to Daniel, who was still in the car, phone pressed to his ear, eyes wide with terror. She could see him mouthing words at her. Get back in the car. Don't provoke them. We'll give them whatever they want. Sweet Daniel, who thought he was her protector, who had no idea what was about to happen. I need 3 more minutes. Irene called to Daniel calmly. Just stay in the car and keep talking to the police. Then she turned back to the 12 men and said something that would be repeated in police reports and witness statements for months afterward. I'm going to ask you one more time. Please walk away, because what happens next is going to be very unpleasant for all of you. The scarred man's face twisted with rage. You know what? Forget the valuables. We're going to teach this mouthy woman some respect. He lunged forward with the tire iron, and in that moment, the gentle woman who cried at sad stories and needed protection from the harsh world disappeared. What remained was something none of these men were prepared for. The tire iron swung toward Irene's head in a vicious arc, fast and brutal, the kind of attack meant to end the confrontation immediately. But Irene wasn't there when it arrived. She'd shifted her weight 6 inches to the left, a minimal movement that made the weapon pass harmlessly through empty air while simultaneously bringing her inside the scarred man's guard. What happened next took less than 2 seconds, but would be replayed on the attacker's phone videos countless times in the days that followed, each viewing bringing fresh disbelief. Irene's right hand struck the man's extended elbow with surgical precision, hyperextending the joint while her left hand twisted the tire iron from his suddenly weakened grip. Before he could process the pain signals his arm was sending, her foot swept his legs out from under him, and the scarred leader of this gang found himself flat on his back in the dusty parking lot, staring up at the sunny sky with the wind knocked out of his lungs. The tire iron was now in Irene's hand. She held it loosely, naturally, the way someone might hold a tennis racket or a kitchen spoon. The 11 remaining men froze, their brains struggling to reconcile what they'd just witnessed with what they'd expected to see. I asked you to walk away, Irene said, her voice still gentle despite the weapon in her hand. Please don't make me hurt anyone else. Inside the car, Daniel had stopped talking to the police dispatcher. He was staring through the windshield at a woman he didn't recognize, a woman who moved like violence was a language she spoke fluently. The moment of shock stillness broke. 3 men rushed Irene simultaneously from different angles, a coordinated attack that would have overwhelmed most people. But Irene had trained for exactly this scenario: multiple attackers. Confined space. The need to neutralize threats quickly without causing permanent damage. The first attacker came from her left, swinging a chain. Irene ducked under the wild swing and drove the tire iron into his solar plexus, just hard enough to fold him in half and send him stumbling backward, gasping for air. The second came from straight ahead with a crowbar. Irene sidestepped, using his momentum against him, guiding his charge past her and into the side of Daniel's car with a hollow thud that left a dent, and the attacker dazed. The third attacker grabbed her from behind, arms wrapping around her waist in a bear hug that lifted her off the ground. This was the kind of attack her instructors in Prague had emphasized: larger opponents using their size advantage. Irene dropped her weight, making herself heavy, then drove her head backward into the man's face. She felt his nose break against the back of her skull, felt his grip loosen, and twisted free, striking him twice in the floating ribs before he could recover. 4 men down in less than 15 seconds. The remaining 8 were recalculating, their confidence shaken, but their pride demanding they continue. They spread out wider, approaching more cautiously now, weapons raised. Stop recording and help. One of them shouted at the 2 men who were still holding up their phones, documenting their crew's humiliation. Those 2 put away their phones and joined the attack, bringing the count back to 10 active threats. Irene tracked them all simultaneously, her training allowing her to maintain awareness of positions and intentions. The sunny afternoon had taken on a strange quality, time seeming to slow as adrenaline sharpened her senses. A baseball bat swung at her ribs. Irene trapped the bat against her side with her arm, twisted it from the attacker's grip, and used it to sweep the legs of the man approaching from her right. She was accumulating weapons now, the tire iron, the baseball bat, and using them not to inflict serious harm, but to control distance and disable attackers. How was she doing this? Someone shouted, genuine fear creeping into his voice. There's one of her and 10 of us. Another yelled back. Just rush her together. They tried. 6 men converged on Irene from all sides, a coordinated assault meant to overwhelm through sheer numbers. This was the moment Daniel thought he would watch the woman he loved disappear beneath a tide of violence. This was the moment he started to open his car door, knowing he needed to help somehow, even though he had no idea what he could possibly do against so many attackers. But Irene moved through the converging attackers, like water flowing around stones. A strike to a knee here, an elbow to a jaw there, using each attacker's body as a shield against the others, maintaining constant motion so they couldn't pin her down or trap her. She was careful, even in the midst of defending herself. She was careful not to cause permanent damage, not to strike with lethal force. These were humans, however misguided and violent. She didn't want to destroy them, just stop them. The parking lot had become a chaotic scene of groaning bodies and scattered weapons. 8 of the 12 attackers were down, some curled in fetal positions, nursing injured joints or ribs. Others simply sitting in shock, trying to understand what had happened to their carefully planned robbery. The 4 still standing had backed away, creating distance between themselves and this small woman in a floral dress who had just systematically dismantled their entire crew. Irene stood near Daniel's car, breathing steadily, her dress torn at the shoulder and dusty from the brief struggle. Sweat had plastered her dark hair to her forehead, but her hands were steady, and her eyes tracked the remaining threats with the calm focus of someone who knew exactly what she was capable of. Police are 7 minutes away, Daniel called from inside the car, his voice shaking. Irene, get back in the car, please. But Irene couldn't retreat yet. The 4 men still standing were conferring, their pride warring with their survival instincts. She recognized the dangerous moment they'd been humiliated in front of each other, recorded on video being beaten by a single woman. That humiliation might drive them to escalate, to pull out hidden weapons, to do something desperate and stupid. This is your last chance, Irene said, raising her voice to carry across the parking lot. Your friends need medical attention. So do some of you, probably. When the police arrive, this can either be attempted robbery or attempted murder. The choice you make in the next 30 seconds will determine which. The scarred man had managed to get to his feet, clutching his hyperextended elbow. His face was pale with pain and rage. You think you've won? You think this is over? I think 12 of you attacked 2 people in broad daylight and lost. Irene replied simply. I think your video evidence shows you initiating violence and me defending myself and my boyfriend. I think when the police review those recordings, they're going to see exactly who the victims were here. One of the 4 still standing, an older man with gray in his beard, seemed to reach a decision. She's right. This is done. We need to leave before the cops show up. We can't just. The scarred man started, but the older man cut him off. Look around, Luca. Half our crew can't even stand. She did this by herself. I've been in this game 20 years, and I've never seen anything like it. We're done. Luca's face twisted with conflicting emotions, rage, humiliation, and underneath it all, fear. He looked at Irene. Really looked at her for the first time, seeing past the small frame and gentle features to whatever lived underneath. Who are you? He asked quietly. Someone who works at a refugee center and wants to go have dinner with her boyfriend's parents, Irene replied. Someone who asked you multiple times to walk away. The sound of sirens was growing louder, approaching from multiple directions. The emergency dispatcher had apparently sent several units, in response to Daniel's panicked description of the attack. The older man grabbed Luca's arm and pulled him toward the van. "What about the others?" one of the remaining men asked, gesturing to the 8 who were still on the ground. "They'll have to explain themselves to the police," the older man replied grimly. "We stay, we all go to prison. At least this way, some of us walk away." The 4 retreated to the van, and within seconds, it was speeding away down the narrow street, leaving 8 of their crew behind. Irene watched them go, knowing she should feel something: triumph, relief, anger. Instead, she just felt tired and sad. This violence, like all violence, had been unnecessary and avoidable. Daniel emerged from the car slowly, as if approaching a wild animal. "Irene? Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," Irene replied, suddenly aware of how she must look to him: torn dress, disheveled hair, surrounded by groaning attackers and scattered weapons. "Are you okay? You were very brave. Calling the police and staying calm." "Brave?" Daniel's voice cracked. "Irene, I just watched you fight off 12 men. I watched you move like. He couldn't find words for what he'd witnessed. The first police car screeched into the parking lot, followed quickly by 2 others. Officers emerged with weapons drawn, trying to make sense of the scene. One small woman standing calmly, one man emerging shakily from a car, and 8 men scattered across the ground in various states of injury. "Police, everyone stay where you are," the lead officer commanded, his weapon trained generally on the scene. Irene raised her hand slowly, making herself non-threatening. "My name is Irene Hill. These men attacked my boyfriend and me. We called emergency services approximately 6 minutes ago. The dispatcher should have our statement on record." The officer's eyes swept the scene, taking in the distribution of bodies. The weapons scattered on the ground, the phone cameras that had captured everything. His weapon lowered slightly. "You're saying you did this? All of this?" "She defended us," Daniel interjected, finding his voice. "They surrounded the car. They had weapons. They were going to. I don't know what they were going to do. Irene stepped out to give me time to call you. She fought all of them." The police station interview room was cold and institutional, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as Irene sat across from Detective Laurent Moreau, a weathered investigator in his 50s who'd seen enough violence in Lyon to be surprised by very little. And yet, as he reviewed the video footage from the attackers' phones, his eyebrows kept rising incrementally with each replay. "Mademoiselle Hill," he said finally, setting down his tablet. "I've been a police officer for 28 years. I've watched a lot of surveillance footage, a lot of altercations. What I'm seeing here," he gestured at the screen, "this isn't amateur hour. You moved with professional training. Military? Law enforcement?" "Neither," Irene replied quietly. She'd been sitting in this room for 2 hours now, giving her statement, answering questions, while Daniel waited in the reception area. "I studied martial arts for several years when I lived in Prague. It was a personal interest, not a career." "Personal interest," Moreau repeated skeptically. "You systematically neutralized 12 armed attackers in approximately 7 minutes without causing any permanent injuries. That's not personal interest, mademoiselle. That's professional-level training." Irene felt the familiar exhaustion settling over her, but this was different from the emotional fatigue she experienced at the refugee center. This was the exhaustion of having a carefully constructed identity stripped away in 7 violent minutes. "I trained intensively for 4 years. Then I moved to Lyon and stopped. I haven't practiced in 3 years except occasionally at home." Moreau leaned back, studying her. "Why stop?" "Because I didn't want to be that person anymore," Irene said simply. "I wanted to help people, not hurt them. The work at the refugee center requires emotional availability, requires softness. You can't be both a fighter and a caregiver. At least, I couldn't. And yet, when the situation demanded it, you became a fighter again. When the situation demanded it, I protected myself and someone I care about," Irene corrected gently. "I didn't want to hurt those men, detective. I asked them multiple times to leave. But they were going to attack Daniel, and I couldn't let that happen. Morrow nodded slowly. The video evidence supports your account completely. All 8 of the men we arrested are being charged with attempted robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, and conspiracy. The 4 who escaped will be identified through the footage and arrested soon. You and Monsieur Rousseau are clear victims here. Then why am I still being interviewed? Irene asked. Because, Moreau said carefully, I need to understand who you really are. The woman who works at the refugee center, who cries at sad stories, who everyone describes as gentle and fragile. Is that person real? Or is she a cover for something else? The question hit Irene harder than any of the physical attacks in the parking lot. She's real, she said, her voice thick with emotion. She's who I want to be. The fighter you saw in that video, she's who I was trained to be. But not who I am. Not who I want to be. You can't be both. Apparently I have to be. Irene replied. And now, there were tears in her eyes. The genuine emotion that everyone at the center would recognize. Because the world won't let me just be gentle. It keeps demanding that I prove I'm strong. And when I prove it, people look at me differently. They stop seeing the person I actually am. Moreau's expression softened. Mademoiselle Hill, you saved yourself and your boyfriend today. You should be proud of that. I am, Irene said quietly. And I'm also sad that it was necessary. I'm sad that 12 young men thought attacking strangers was acceptable behavior. I'm sad that I had to hurt them to stop them. I'm sad that Daniel now looks at me like I'm a stranger. I'm just sad. The detective nodded understanding. You're free to go. We'll need you to return for formal statements and potentially to testify when this goes to trial. But for now, you're done here. Irene stood, smoothing her torn dress, suddenly aware of how she must look. What will happen to them? The 8 you arrested? Prison time, almost certainly. They have previous records, most of them. This wasn't their first attack, just their first failure. Moreau paused at the door. They're lucky, actually. If you'd wanted to seriously hurt them, you could have. Instead, you showed remarkable restraint. That speaks to character. In the reception area, Daniel was pacing, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke rapidly to someone. When he saw Irene emerge, he ended the call abruptly and rushed toward her. Are you okay? They wouldn't let me see you. They kept asking me questions about whether I knew about your training, whether we'd planned this somehow, whether… Daniel, Irene interrupted gently. I'm fine. We can go now. They walked to his car in silence. The parking lot attack had left the Peugeot with a significant dent and a shattered window, but it was still drivable. Daniel started the engine but didn't immediately put it in gear. Instead, he sat with his hands on the wheel, staring straight ahead. Who are you? He asked finally, his voice barely audible. The question hung in the car's confined space like smoke, heavy and impossible to ignore. Irene looked at Daniel's profile, the strong jaw she'd admired, the gentle eyes that had always looked at her with such protective concern, now clouded with confusion, and something that looked uncomfortably like fear. I'm the same person I was this morning, Irene said quietly. The same person you picked up from work. The same person who was planning to have dinner with your parents. No, Daniel shook his head slowly. The person I knew this morning wouldn't. What I saw back there, Irene. That wasn't you. That couldn't have been you. But it was me, Irene replied, feeling something crack inside her chest. It's always been me. You just never saw that part before. Daniel finally turned to look at her, and the expression on his face made Irene's heart sink. It wasn't admiration, or relief, or even curiosity. It was uncertainty mixed with a hint of betrayal. You lied to me. All this time. You let me think you were. That you needed. Protection? Irene finished for him. I never asked you to protect me, Daniel. You decided I needed protecting. And I didn't correct you because… She paused, trying to find honest words. Because it was easier. Because being the fragile girlfriend meant I didn't have to explain my past or justify my choices. Your past, Daniel repeated. 4 years of intensive martial arts training in Prague. How did I not know this? We've been together 6 months. Irene. 6 months of telling me about your life. And you never mentioned that you could. He gestured helplessly toward the parking lot they'd left behind. That you could do that. Would you have believed me if I'd told you? Irene asked. If I'd said on our first date, by the way, I can fight off multiple attackers simultaneously. Would you have taken me seriously? Or would you have laughed and thought I was exaggerating? Daniel's silence was answer enough. He put the car in gear and pulled out of the police station parking lot, driving toward the highway with mechanical precision. The sunny afternoon had faded into early evening, casting golden light across Lyon's suburbs as they drove in oppressive quiet. Finally, Daniel spoke again. I don't understand why you'd hide something like that. Most people would be proud of those skills. Most people aren't trying to work with traumatized refugee families who need to see gentleness, not strength. Irene replied. Most people aren't dealing with colleagues who already question whether they're too sensitive for the job. If everyone at the center knew about my training, they'd treat me differently. They'd assume I was hard instead of soft, closed instead of open. I couldn't do my work effectively if they saw me as a fighter first. So you lied to everyone. To your colleagues, to Madame Laurent, to Thomas, to me. You let us all believe you were something you're not. I didn't lie, Irene said, her voice rising slightly. I am exactly who I appeared to be. I do cry at sad stories. I am emotionally available to the families we serve. I am gentle and kind, and all the things you saw. The fighting skills don't negate any of that. They're just another part of who I am. A pretty significant part. Apparently, Daniel muttered. They drove another 15 minutes in silence before Daniel suddenly pulled off the highway into a rest area. He parked in a far corner, away from the few other cars, and turned off the engine. For a long moment, he just sat there, hands gripping the wheel, staring at nothing. I was terrified today, he finally said, his voice thick with emotion. When we were surrounded, when I saw how many of them there were, all I could think was that I was going to watch you get hurt, and I couldn't stop it. I was completely useless. I just sat in the car with my phone while you... He swallowed hard. While you handled everything. Irene reached for his hand, but Daniel pulled away. The rejection stung more than any of the physical blows she'd absorbed in the parking lot. I'm supposed to be your protector, Daniel continued. That's who I am. That's what I do. I'm the strong one, the one who keeps you safe. But today, you didn't need me. You've never needed me. I've been playing a role in a relationship where I wasn't actually necessary. That's not true, Irene protested. I do need you, Daniel. Just not in the way you assumed. Then how? Daniel turned to face her, his eyes searching. How do you need me, Irene? What role do I play if I'm not protecting you? The question revealed something Irene had suspected for weeks, but hadn't wanted to acknowledge. Daniel's identity, his sense of self-worth in their relationship, was built entirely on her perceived fragility. Without that foundation, he didn't know who they were to each other. I need you the way any partner needs another, Irene said carefully. For companionship, for emotional support, for sharing life's experiences, I need someone who sees me as complete, not as someone who needs fixing or protecting. But that's not what we've been, Daniel said flatly. Our entire relationship has been me taking care of you, worrying about you, making sure you're safe and comfortable. If you don't need that, then what have we been doing for 6 months? The rest area had emptied. As evening deepened into dusk, security lights flickered on automatically, casting harsh white illumination across the parking lot. Inside the car, Irene and Daniel sat in their separate silences, the weight of unspoken realizations pressing down on them both. I think, Irene said slowly, choosing her words with the same care she'd use with a traumatized child at the center, that we've both been playing roles that felt comfortable but weren't entirely honest. What's that supposed to mean? Daniel asked, defensive. It means you wanted to be the protector because it made you feel needed and important. And I let you be that because it was easier than explaining my complicated history. Irene turned in her seat to face him fully. But neither of those things is love, Daniel. They're just convenient dynamics that let us avoid harder conversations. So our entire relationship is a lie? No, Irene said firmly. But it might be built on incomplete information. You fell in love with a version of me that I let you see, and I fell in love with your kindness and attention, not questioning too deeply why you were drawn to someone you perceived as fragile. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was small, almost childlike. My mother is very fragile. She has anxiety, depression, panic attacks. My father and I spend our lives managing her emotions, protecting her from stress, making sure she's okay. It's exhausting, but it's also the only way I know how to love someone, taking care of them, being needed. The admission opened a window into Daniel's psychology that Irene hadn't fully understood before. And when you met me, you saw someone who seemed to need that same kind of care. You cried at the fundraising event. You were so overwhelmed by everyone's stories. I thought. Daniel's voice cracked. I thought you were someone who needed me the way my mother does. Someone I could take care of and feel necessary for. But I'm not your mother, Irene said gently. And you're not obligated to parent your romantic partners. That's not what healthy relationships look like. Then what do healthy relationships look like? Daniel asked, and there was genuine confusion in his voice. Because right now, I have no idea what we are to each other. Irene considered the question carefully. Healthy relationships are about two complete people choosing to share their lives. Not one strong person and one weak person, but two people with different strengths and vulnerabilities who support each other. But you don't have any vulnerabilities, Daniel protested. You can fight off 12 men. You're completely self-sufficient. What could you possibly need from me? I have plenty of vulnerabilities, Irene replied. And now tears were forming in her eyes, the genuine emotion that had always been real, never performance. I get overwhelmed by the stories I hear at work. I struggle with nightmares about my grandfather's experiences in the resistance. I sometimes feel isolated because I can't fully be myself with anyone. I need someone who sees all of me, the fighter and the caregiver, the strong and the sensitive, and doesn't try to reduce me to just one thing. I don't know if I can be that person, Daniel admitted quietly. I don't know how to be in a relationship where I'm not the protector. The honesty was painful but necessary. Irene reached out again for Daniel's hand, and this time he didn't pull away. Then maybe we need to take some time. Maybe we need to figure out who we are separately before we can figure out who we are together. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. Are you breaking up with me? I'm suggesting we pause, Irene said carefully. Today was traumatic for both of us in different ways. You need time to process what you saw. And I need time to figure out how to integrate these different parts of myself instead of keeping them separate. I don't want to lose you, Daniel said, his voice breaking. You're not losing me, Irene replied. But you might need to get to know the real me. And I might need to learn how to let someone see all of me without apologizing for any part of it. They sat together in the dimming light, holding hands across the center console, both grieving the relationship they'd thought they had while wondering if something more authentic might be possible. Eventually, Daniel started the car again. I should take you home, he said quietly. What about dinner with your parents? I can't face them right now. I'll tell them we had car trouble or something. Daniel pulled back onto the highway. Besides, you probably want to be alone. Irene didn't correct him, though she wondered if his assumption that she wanted solitude was another projection of his own needs onto her. The drive to her apartment took 20 minutes, and they spent it in silence, processing the day's events in their separate ways. When Daniel pulled up outside her building, he turned to her with an expression that was trying for brave but landing somewhere near devastated. Will you call me? When you're ready to talk more? I will, Irene promised. But Daniel, When we do talk, I need you to be honest about whether you can accept all of who I am. Not just the gentle parts, but the strong parts too. I'll try, Daniel said, though his voice carried little conviction. Irene leaned over and kissed his cheek gently. That's all anyone can do. She got out of the car and walked toward her building, feeling Daniel's eyes on her back until she disappeared inside. The morning after the parking lot incident, Irene woke to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. The news had spread with the viral efficiency of modern social media. Someone, probably one of the attacker's friends, had posted the video footage online, and it had exploded across French social networks overnight. "Tiny woman destroys dozen armed men," read one headline. "You won't believe what this woman did to her attackers," screamed another. Irene's phone buzzed continuously as she made coffee, each notification bringing a new friend, colleague, or acquaintance demanding to know if the woman in the video was really her. She ignored them all, sitting at her small kitchen table and watching the sunrise paint her apartment walls gold, trying to center herself for what she knew would be a difficult day. The call she'd been dreading came at 7 in the morning. Madame Laurent's name appeared on her screen, and Irene answered with trepidation. "Irene." Madame Laurent's voice was carefully controlled. "I've seen the videos. I need you to come to the center immediately. We need to discuss this situation." "Am I being fired?" Irene asked directly. There was a pause. "We need to discuss the situation," Madame Laurent repeated. Which wasn't a no. Irene arrived at the Centre d'École et d'Intégration to find a media circus outside. 3 news vans had parked across the street, and reporters with cameras were interviewing anyone who walked past. She pulled her jacket hood up and entered through the back entrance, hoping to avoid attention. Inside, the normal bustle of the center had been replaced with an electric tension. Volunteers and staff members stopped their conversations when they saw her, some staring openly, others whispering behind their hands. Irene walked through the corridor to Madame Laurent's office, feeling like she was moving through a spotlight. Thomas Beaumont intercepted her outside the director's door. "Irene, my God, is it really you in those videos? Did you really fight off 12 men?" "Yes," Irene said simply. "It was self-defense, Thomas. They attacked us. But how? When? I mean." Thomas struggled to reconcile the woman he'd worked with for 3 years with the fighter in the viral videos. You can barely stand up to angry clients without getting emotional. How can you possibly? Being emotional and being capable aren't mutually exclusive. Irene said quietly, then knocked on Madame Laurent's door. The office was cramped and cluttered with files, donation records, and photographs of refugee families the center had helped over the years. Madame Laurent sat behind her desk, her expression unreadable. She gestured for Irene to sit. "Close the door," she said. Irene complied and took the offered chair, her hands folded in her lap, waiting. "I've watched the videos multiple times," Madame Laurent began. "I've read the police reports that Detective Moreau was kind enough to share. And I've spent the entire night trying to reconcile the woman in those videos with the Irene Hill who has worked at this center for 3 years. I'm the same person," Irene said, though the words felt hollow even to her. "Are you?" Madame Laurent leaned forward. "Because the Irene I know cries when children tell sad stories. The Irene I know gets overwhelmed by confrontation. The Irene I know needs to be protected from our more difficult clients. Yet the woman in those videos moved with professional violence, systematically neutralizing threats with a level of skill that suggests extensive training. I trained in Prague before I moved here," Irene explained. "It was part of my life then, but not part of my life now. I don't advertise it because it's not relevant to my work here." "Not relevant?" Madame Laurent's eyebrows rose. "Irene, your emotional availability is the foundation of your work with traumatized families. If that emotional availability is performance rather than genuine, 1. It's not performance," Irene interrupted, her voice sharp. "My emotions are real, Madame Laurent. My tears are genuine. My empathy for our clients is authentic. The fact that I also have physical skills doesn't make any of that false." But you've been hiding those skills deliberately. You've been allowing us to treat you as fragile when you're clearly not. That suggests a level of calculated deception that I find troubling. The accusation stung precisely because it contained truth. Irene had allowed people's misconceptions to stand uncorrected. She'd benefited from being underestimated, had used it as armor against expectations and demands. I wasn't deceiving anyone, Irene said carefully. I was protecting my ability to do my job. If everyone here knew about my training, they would treat me differently. They'd see me as hard instead of soft, as a fighter instead of a caregiver. And I can't help traumatized families if they see me as threatening. Madame Laurent considered this. So you compartmentalized. You decided that being effective at your job required hiding part of who you are. Yes, Irene admitted. Is that wrong? I don't know, Madame Laurent said honestly. But I do know that as of this morning, your ability to maintain that compartmentalization is over. Everyone has seen those videos. Every staff member, every volunteer, probably every refugee family we serve. You can't put that back in the box. The reality of Madame Laurent's words settled over Irene like a weight. The director was right. There was no going back to being invisible. No returning to the comfortable anonymity of being overlooked. The viral videos had stripped away her carefully constructed persona and exposed the complexity she'd been hiding. What happens now? Irene asked quietly. Madame Laurent sighed, suddenly looking older and more tired. Honestly, I'm not sure. The board will need to meet. Some members are concerned about liability if you're capable of that level of violence. What happens if you lose control with a difficult client? That's absurd, Irene protested. I've worked here 3 years without incident. I've de-escalated countless confrontations using words and patience, not violence. Yesterday was self-defense against armed attackers. It's not relevant to my work here. I agree with you, Madame Laurent said. But I'm not the only voice in these decisions. The board meets tomorrow. Until then, I need you to take a few days off. Paid leave. She added quickly, seeing Irene's expression. This isn't a suspension. It's just. We need time to figure out how to handle this situation. Irene stood to leave, then paused at the door. Madame Laurent, may I ask you something? Of course. If I had been a man with the same training, would this be a problem? Would the board be meeting to discuss whether male colleagues with military experience or martial arts backgrounds pose a liability to clients? Madame Laurent's expression tightened. That's not a fair comparison, isn't it? Irene challenged gently. Thomas Beaumont has told me stories about his rugby days, about fights after matches, about the aggressive physicality of the sport. No one questions his ability to be gentle with refugee children. Why is my capacity for violence seen as incompatible with compassion when men's capacity for violence is just considered normal? The director had no immediate answer. Irene took her silence as permission to leave. The walk through the center's corridors was different now. People no longer glanced away politely. They stared openly, some with admiration, others with confusion or suspicion. A group of teenage refugee boys stopped their soccer game in the courtyard to watch her pass, whispering excitedly in Arabic. She caught fragments the woman from the video, and she fights like in the movies. Outside, one of the news crews spotted her and rushed forward. Microphones extended. Mademoiselle Hill, can you comment on the videos? Where did you learn to fight like that? Are you concerned about legal repercussions? Irene kept walking, pulling her jacket tighter, but the reporters followed. How does it feel to be a viral sensation? Have you been contacted by any self-defense instructors? Would you do it again? Please leave me alone, Irene said firmly, but they continued pursuing her down the street, cameras rolling. Finally, a police car pulled up beside them. Detective Moreau emerged, his expression stern. Messieurs, mesdames, this woman is a victim of a violent crime. If you continue to harass her, I will arrest you for obstruction of justice. She has already given her statement. The reporters reluctantly backed off, though cameras continued recording from a distance. Moreau gestured for Irene to get in the car. Thank you. Irene said, as he drove away from the center. Don't thank me yet, Morrow replied. I'm not being entirely altruistic. I need to ask you some questions about the 4 men who escaped yesterday. We've identified them, but we need your help locating them. I don't know where they are, Irene said, confused. No, but you might be able to help us understand their psychology. You see, Mademoiselle Hill, this gang has been operating in Lyon for 3 years. They've committed 17 robberies that we know of, always targeting lone drivers or couples, always using overwhelming numbers. Until yesterday, they'd never failed. And now they're humiliated, Irene said, understanding immediately. They'll want revenge. Exactly. Which means you and Monsieur Rousseau might be in danger. Moreau pulled into the police station parking lot. We're offering protective custody until we apprehend the remaining 4 suspects. For how long? Could be days, could be weeks. We're working with informants. But these men have gone to ground. Irene thought about hiding in a safe house, about putting her life on hold indefinitely because 12 men had made a bad decision to attack strangers. The thought was exhausting. I appreciate the offer, detective, but I'm not going into hiding. I've spent 3 years hiding parts of myself, making myself smaller and quieter to fit other people's expectations. I'm done with that. This isn't about expectations, mademoiselle. This is about your safety, and I'm responsible for my own safety, Irene replied firmly. Those men discovered that yesterday. If they want to try again, they'll get the same result. Moreau studied her for a long moment. You know, most victims of violent crime want protection afterward. They're traumatized, frightened. You're not frightened at all, are you? I'm scared of a lot of things, detective. I'm scared of losing my job, of losing the work I love, of being defined by violence instead of compassion. But I'm not scared of those 4 men. They're not brave enough to attack someone they know can defend themselves. They'll find easier targets. That's what concerns me, Moreau said quietly. If they can't get to you, they might target someone associated with you. Friends, family, colleagues. The thought hadn't occurred to Irene, and it sent a chill down her spine. Daniel, Thomas, Madame Laurent, the refugee families she worked with, all potentially at risk because of her actions. What do you need from me? She asked. Help us find them quickly. You fought them. You observed their tactics, their communication patterns, their hierarchy. Give us insights that might help us predict their next move. Irene spent the next 3 hours at the police station, working with Detective Moreau and his team to analyze everything she'd observed during the attack. She described the group's dynamics, how the scarred man, Luca, had been the nominal leader, but how the older man with the gray beard had held the real authority. She explained the attack patterns, the way they'd coordinated their approach, the moment when their confidence had shattered. They thought they were attacking prey. Irene explained to the assembled detectives. When I proved to be something else, their entire psychological framework collapsed. The 4 who escaped did so because they recognized the situation had become untenable. They're rational, calculating. They won't come after me directly because they know it's a losing proposition. But they might strike indirectly, Moreau said. Possibly. Or they might just disappear. Lyon is a large city. France is a large country. They could relocate, start over somewhere their reputation isn't destroyed by viral videos. One of the younger detectives, Officer Lemaire, had been reviewing the social media response to the videos. The overwhelming sentiment is supportive of you, Mademoiselle Hill. People are calling you a hero, an inspiration. There are already online petitions demanding that you face no legal consequences. I'm not concerned about legal consequences, Irene said. The video evidence is clear. It was self-defense. Still, Lemaire continued, you've become something of a symbol overnight. Women's self-defense groups are sharing your videos as motivation. There are already memes circulating. He showed her his phone screen, where someone had edited the footage with superhero effects and inspirational music. Irene felt uncomfortable looking at herself, transformed into entertainment, into a symbol for causes she hadn't chosen to represent. I just wanted to protect myself and Daniel. I didn't want to become a public figure. Too late for that, I'm afraid, Moreau said, not unkindly. The world loves a David and Goliath story. Small woman defeats gang of large men. It's compelling narrative. But it reduces everything to a simple story. Irene protested. It erases the complexity, the training that made it possible, the fact that I was trying to avoid violence until the last possible moment. People will see the videos and think anyone can do what I did if they're just brave enough. And that's not true? Lemaire asked. No, it's not. What I did required years of training, specific techniques, and honestly, a lot of luck. I could have been seriously hurt. If one of them had had a gun, if they'd been more coordinated, if the terrain had been different, there were a dozen variables that could have changed the outcome. Turning it into an inspirational story encourages people to put themselves in danger. Moreau nodded thoughtfully. You could use your platform to clarify that. Give interviews explaining the reality behind the videos. Or I could refuse all interviews and let the story die naturally, Irene countered. That's certainly an option, Moreau agreed. Though in my experience, refusing to engage with media only makes them more persistent. They fill the silence with speculation and assumptions, often creating a narrative that's further from the truth than what you'd have said yourself. Irene left the police station as afternoon faded toward evening, her head spinning with decisions she'd never wanted to make. Her phone continued buzzing with messages from journalists requesting interviews, from martial arts schools offering sponsorships, from women thanking her for showing them what was possible, from critics calling her violent and aggressive. She ignored them all and walked to the one place she knew she could find peace, the small chapel near her apartment that served as a community meditation space. It was non-denominational, welcoming anyone seeking quiet reflection. Irene had visited occasionally over the past 3 years when the work at the center became overwhelming. Inside, the space was dim and cool, afternoon light filtering through stained glass windows in patterns of blue and gold. 2 other people sat in separate pews, absorbed in their own contemplations. Irene slid into a back row and closed her eyes, trying to find the centered calm that had always been her foundation. But peace eluded her. Her mind kept replaying the attack, not the physical confrontations, but the moments before when she'd asked the men to walk away, when she'd tried to de-escalate, when she'd genuinely hoped to avoid violence. Those moments were missing from the viral videos. The footage showed only the dramatic fight, not the desperate attempts at prevention that preceded it. You look troubled. Irene opened her eyes to find an elderly nun sitting in the pew beside her. Sister Amelie had run the meditation space for 40 years and had a reputation for appearing exactly when people needed guidance. I've had a difficult couple of days, Irene admitted. I know, Sister Amelie said gently. I've seen the videos. All of Lyon has seen the videos. Irene felt tears building. I didn't want this. I just wanted to help people at the refugee center, to make a small difference in the world. Now, I'm famous for violence. You're famous for survival, Sister Amelie corrected. There's a difference. Is there? People are celebrating the fact that I hurt 12 men. They're not talking about why I had to hurt them or what I tried to do to avoid it. They just see the violence and think it's heroic. Sister Amélie was quiet for a moment. Do you know what I think when I watch those videos? What? I think, there is a woman who prepared herself for the worst while hoping for the best. There is someone who developed skills she hoped never to use but had them ready when necessary. That's not violence for its own sake. That's wisdom. The words settled something in Irene's chest. Everyone at the center looks at me differently now. They think they didn't know me, that I was hiding my true self. Were you? I don't know anymore, Irene admitted. I thought I was protecting my ability to do my work by keeping my past separate, but maybe I was just protecting myself from being fully known. 3 weeks after the parking lot incident, Irene stood before the board of directors of the Centre d'Accueil et d'Intégration, waiting to learn whether she still had a job. The conference room was formal and uncomfortable. 8 board members seated around a polished table. their expressions ranging from sympathetic to skeptical. Madame Laurent, sitting at the head of the table, began. Mademoiselle Hill, we've spent the past 3 weeks reviewing your work history, interviewing colleagues and clients, and considering the implications of the recent incident. The board has discussed your case extensively. Irene stood straight, her hands clasped in front of her, prepared for whatever came next. Some board members, Madame Laurent continued, felt that your undisclosed combat training represented a fundamental dishonesty that compromised your relationship with the families we serve. Others argued that your personal history is irrelevant to your professional performance, which has been exemplary. And what did you conclude? Irene asked when Madame Laurent paused. The director's face broke into a slight smile. We concluded that you're more valuable to this organization than we initially realized. Not in spite of your unique background, but because of it. You've proven that strength and compassion aren't mutually exclusive. That someone can be both a fighter and a healer, both tough and tender. Irene felt relief wash through her, followed immediately by uncertainty. So, I'm not being fired? No, Madame Laurent said firmly. In fact, we'd like to expand your role. We've been receiving inquiries from refugee families about self-defense training, particularly women who've experienced violence in their home countries. We'd like you to develop a program that teaches practical safety skills while maintaining the emotional support that's been your strength. The proposal surprised Irene. You want me to teach fighting? We want you to teach empowerment. One of the board members, Monsieur Durand, clarified. Physical skills are part of that, but so is the psychological resilience you've demonstrated. You've shown that being gentle doesn't mean being helpless. That's a powerful message for people who've been victimized. Irene considered the proposal. It would mean integrating the parts of herself she'd kept separate, finding a way to be both the compassionate caregiver and the capable fighter. It felt risky but also oddly right. I'd be honored, she said finally. After the board meeting, Irene walked through the center's corridors with Madame Laurent. The atmosphere had shifted in the 3 weeks since the incident. People still stared sometimes, but now with respect rather than confusion. The teenage refugee boys had started greeting her with elaborate fist bumps. Several women had asked her privately about learning self-defense. There's someone here to see you, Madame Laurent said as they reached the reception area. He's been waiting for an hour. Daniel stood by the window, looking uncomfortable and hopeful. He'd texted Irene several times over the past weeks, tentative messages asking how she was doing, whether she was safe, whether they could talk. She'd responded politely, but hadn't agreed to meet. Now, seeing him in person, she felt the familiar mix of affection and uncertainty. I'll leave you two alone, Madame Laurent said, discreetly withdrawing. Hi, Daniel said as Irene approached. I wasn't sure you'd see me. I almost didn't, Irene admitted. What are you doing here, Daniel? I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About needing someone who sees all of you. He paused, gathering courage. I don't know if I can be that person, Irene. I don't know if I can unlearn a lifetime of needing to be the protector, but I want to try. Why? Irene asked gently. Because I miss you. And because I realized that what scared me most wasn't seeing you fight. It was realizing how little I actually knew you. I'd built this entire image in my head of who you were, and when that image shattered, I felt lost. But the real you, complex and capable and still emotionally available, that person is more interesting than the one I invented. Irene felt something soften in her chest. This isn't going to be easy, Daniel. I'm still figuring out how to integrate these different parts of myself. I can't help you figure out how to accept them while I'm still working on accepting them myself. Then maybe we figure it out together, Daniel suggested. No protector, no protected. Just two people trying to understand each other better. Just two people, Irene repeated, and it sounded right in a way their previous dynamic never had. They walked out of the center together into a sunny afternoon that reminded Irene of the day everything changed. 3 weeks ago, she'd been someone trying to hide half of who she was, believing that showing her full self would cost her the things she valued. Now she was someone learning that authentic strength includes vulnerability, That true courage sometimes means being fully seen. Her phone buzzed with another interview request, this one from a women's advocacy organization. Irene looked at it for a moment, then deleted it. She wasn't ready to be a public figure or a symbol. She was just Irene Hill, a woman who worked with refugee families and happened to have unusual skills. That was enough. "I heard about your new program," Daniel said as they walked. "Teaching self-defense to refugee women. That's amazing, Irene." "It's terrifying," Irene corrected. "I've never taught before. What if I'm not good at it?" "You'll figure it out," Daniel said with simple confidence. "You're good at everything you actually try to do." Irene laughed, surprised by how good it felt. "That's not true at all. I'm terrible at cooking. I can barely keep my apartment clean. I cry at sad commercials." "You're also capable of defending yourself against 12 attackers," Daniel pointed out. "Those things aren't contradictory," Irene said, and this time she believed it. "I can be both. We all can be both, whatever both means for each of us." They reached the small cafe where they'd had their first date 6 months ago. It felt simultaneously like yesterday and a lifetime ago. So much had changed. And yet the afternoon sun still painted the street in gold. The city still hummed with its usual energy, and two people were still trying to figure out how to know each other honestly. "Coffee?" Daniel offered. "Coffee," Irene agreed. As they entered the cafe, Irene caught her reflection in the window, a small woman in practical clothes, unremarkable to any casual observer. But now she knew what that reflection didn't show: the years of training, the careful preparation, the complex interior life that defied simple categorization. She'd spent so long trying to be one thing or another, fighter or caregiver, strong or gentle. Finally, she was beginning to understand that she could simply be human, complicated, contradictory, and completely whole. The viral videos would eventually fade from social media. The attackers would be caught and prosecuted. Life would return to its normal rhythms. But something fundamental had shifted for Irene Hill on that sunny afternoon in a parking lot outside Lyon. She'd stopped performing fragility and started living authentically. And while the world might celebrate her for 7 minutes of dramatic violence, she knew the real victory was much quieter. Learning to stand fully in her own identity, all the contradictions and complexities included. Behind her, Daniel held the cafe door open, waiting. Ahead, through the window, she could see the cozy interior where they'd begin the difficult work of building something more honest than what they'd had before. It wouldn't be easy. Real relationships, real identities, real lives, none of it was easy. But it was authentic. And after 3 years of careful compartmentalization, authenticity felt like the bravest choice she'd ever made. Irene walked through the door into the warm cafe, into the uncertain future, into the complicated reality of being fully human. And, for the first time in a very long time, she wasn't afraid of being seen. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.